Okay, welcome everyone. Wow, we are global here with the people that are joining us. I'm Carol Levy. I'm Vice President of Marketing for ECI, which is Ethics and Compliance Initiative. I would love to welcome you to our webcast. This is a joint collaboration with ECI. We are a leading membership organization driving business integrity, and Sounding Board, which is the dynamic tech-led company offering a people-focused approach to driving leadership development. We welcome you because we think that skills versus capacity and how to develop dynamic leaders is so important today. Not just from the ethics and compliance standpoint, from the HR standpoint, and from just the people-centric standpoint for all companies. I'd like to start by introducing the two participants who are going to lead you through this journey today. First is Lori Maison, co-founder and chief coaching officer and president of Sounding Board. She's one of the most prolific executive coaches for Fortune 500 C-suite companies. She and her co-founder, Christine Tao, developed an extraordinary company that connects business leaders with business outcomes and shapes the leaders for tomorrow. It is a dynamic, wonderful platform, and we hope that you will take advantage of it as you see fit. Then there's Katie Lang, who is the senior researcher and special projects manager for ECI. Katie's been seminal to the most recent research reports for ECI, including one that has just been published on ESG. She also helps develop programs that deliver value to ECI's membership. Before we begin, there's two housekeeping notes. One is a CEU certificate will be available for download halfway through this event, but please stay till the end because there's some great information there. And you can submit questions throughout this event at the feature on the bottom left of your screen. So don't forget to keep putting the questions in there. Sometimes the speakers will stop and answer your question, but most likely we'll try and get to them at the very end. If we do not get to answer all of your questions, there will be an email at the end, and we will try and make sure that we answer them in a timely manner. With that, I'd love to turn the program over to Katie Lang. Enjoy.
Thank you, Carol. I'm so excited to have some time with you this afternoon, and I'm so excited to share with Lori this hour because she has wonderful information. So before we get started, I want to talk about what we're going to be doing. What awesome skills and amazing new knowledge and capacity are you going to walk away with? We're going to actually talk about skills and capacity and trying to find the balance between vertical and horizontal development. And you might be thinking, I don't know what vertical and horizontal development is, but you will by the end. And we're also going to talk about how we can shift mindsets and behaviors and to develop dynamic ethical leaders. So we're going to be talking a lot about leadership. And again, we're so excited to have Lori with us today because she has so many great insights and wonderful stories and just a wonderful way of framing this. So
Great.
Why do we actually need to talk about leadership? I know, I'm very excited. As people who know me know, I get really excited, but I'm particularly excited today to talk about
I'm happy to be here.
So why do we need to talk about leadership? Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of background from ECI's perspective. First, one thing that people may not realize is when you ask employees who are senior leaders, we always assume it's the CEO and it's the C-suite, and it is those people. But for a lot of employees who are senior leaders, who are top managers, it's their supervisor or the person above their supervisor. So they're not just looking for messaging from the very top. The very top for them may just be the person that they work with every day. So leadership at all levels matters. The other piece of information I want to give you, and really gets to the idea of this integrity gap, is that the experiences of leaders are very different than the experiences of people who aren't leaders. One of the things that we've known this for 20 years, is that managers have a rosier view of what's happening in the organization. They're more likely to have positive perceptions of what's happening and positive perceptions of how well they're doing. They think that top managers and supervisors are good examples more than employees do. They think employees know that they won't be retaliated against if they report more than employees do. They believe that employees are treated with dignity and respect at a higher rate than employees actually say that amongst themselves. They also think that they have reasonable expectations so that employees don't have to compromise their standards. So managers have this sense that they're doing an even better job than employees think they're doing. And then as a secondary piece, there's also this, and this gets to the integrity gap. There's this interesting contrast. They also are more likely to talk about compromising standards. So they're more likely to agree that employees will get promoted even if they compromise standards. They're also more likely to believe that employees will bend the rules for personal gain, and that supervisors value targets over doing the right thing. So they have this sense that employees aren't facing as much. And they also have the sense that more bad things happen. It's this weird sort of conflicting sense of how well they're doing, and what their employees are facing. So there's definitely a difference between what leaders are experiencing at all levels and what employees are experiencing. This makes it really challenging for employees. I'm actually going to turn over to Lori to talk about not just sort of the global perspective of management versus employees, but also some things that are happening in the world today.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. I'm very happy to be here. I want to just start out by validating something that Katie said, which I think is a really interesting concept people don't think about very much, that the senior leaders in an organization are actually the middle managers, the directors, maybe the early VPs, maybe even some longer time senior managers. Because those are the leaders that employees have the most contact with. So at Sounding Board, we're developing leaders of all levels, and we actually name that group of folks senior leaders. The people who are SVP and above, and all of your ethics and compliance officers, those are really executive leaders. They might be setting the direction for the organization, but employees are not having a lot of contact with those folks. So who is leading those employees? It's really that middle group of leaders that I think don't get nearly as much attention as they really should. So why are we even having to talk about leadership so much these days? One of the main reasons is because the environment has changed so dramatically over the last 20 to 40 years. So this slide shows some of the differences that we're experiencing. And I'm just going to kind of like summarize it, which is, if you think back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the work environment was just a lot more homogenous. There was less diversity. There was primarily men in the leadership roles. Everybody was in office. And like an example is, I've been an executive coach for, unfortunately, dating myself, almost 30 years now. And the first 10 years of my executive coaching career, I only coached men because only men were in leadership roles at that time. And much of the leader development that we currently use originated during that time frame in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And what's really unfortunate is we're still using those approaches to leader development. And if you just notice the changes from that time frame, it's very dramatic. So one of our pushes is like, hey, let's kind of update how we're developing leaders, because what used to work in the last century no longer works in this century.
I love that contrast that you just put in. And one of the things that's so interesting to me about this slide and about what you're presenting, and about the concept of leadership in general, is there's a lot of challenges, right? Things are harder. Things are just much more complicated. But I look at this list, and the other thing that strikes me is how much opportunity there is. I mean, we have a webcast with hundreds of people on it who are all over the world. That would not have happened 40 years ago.
That's exactly right.
Honestly, the issue of just being men in leadership, now we have, wonderful, talented women. It strikes me as such a wonderful example of this slide of, it's a lot harder, it's a lot more challenging, a lot more complex, but there's also such amazing potential for growth, and so much amazing potential to think more broadly and to lean into the opportunity that's also there. So I want to talk a little bit about what does a 21st century look like? What is the opportunity? What is the need?
Right. So, one of the big opportunities now is to expand how we think about leadership and leader development. So, in the last century, we primarily focused on skills and skill development. And even up to, say, pre pandemic, that was still a big thing. The language about upskilling, reskilling, we have skill development platforms. Skill development's been around really since the 70s. Anyone who has participated or delivered in skill development, though, knows that the transfer to daily work life is very low. In fact, there was a stat from, I think it was Gallup, who said only 1 in 10 employees who received compliance training actually did anything different in their daily work life. So, skill development's necessary, required, but it's not enough in the current, much more complex environment. The next place to go is capabilities, which is really a combination of sets of skills and also a way of thinking. Many companies have a leadership capability framework that they use to try to help create alignment on the approach to leadership. And this is the next level because it's combining some of the original skills that you learned as an employee and then putting those to use really in a leadership uh, situation or environment. What's really brand new is this idea of capacity. When the environment's more predictable, more homogeneous, more maybe calm, less changeable, skills and capabilities really enough to handle that. But when you add the volatility of the current environment, the overwhelming amount of information, the technology advancements, now you need something more complex and more meaty to help your leaders really thrive in this kind of situation. And so we've added this idea of capacity. It's really this concept of being able to contain or hold everything that's going on, and then be able to use sets of capabilities to contextually address that environment. So the idea is now those skills that worked in a certain predictable environment don't really work in the current environment. And the current environment requires a much more dynamic, thoughtful, situational, contextual approach to leadership.
So I'm going to ask you a question I didn't tell you I was going to ask. So I'm putting you on the spot, but I know you got this. In some sense, is this sort of a developmental model? And just to give you background, I'm come from an education background, so I kind of think of it developmental. So kind of skills is where people start, and then when they have more experience and they have kind of a broader vision, they move to capabilities. But then when they're in a better place or even more experienced and they have this sort of wisdom of dealing with in the day-to-day, they're more at their capacity level. Is that how the different pieces work together?
It's funny because it's really more a historical model. We started with skills, we went to capabilities, went to capacity.
That makes sense.
But it does actually work that way as well. The capacity is sort of like a leadership maturity scale in a way. So, yeah, you could mature as a leader early in your career, but it's going to be hard to do that just with skills. And I know everyone knows this because everyone takes all the leadership skill development, but then what makes the difference between a good leader and a really exceptional leader? It's in the capacity range.
That makes sense. I'd love to take a moment and just drill down at that base level, that skill level, which you're using the term horizontal development. Can you explain a little bit more about that and maybe give us an example of what it looks like?
Yes, sure. So we're starting to use this new language, horizontal and vertical development. Horizontal really is what we have been doing in the past. It's the basic skill development, it's group training, it's here's ideas, you go and figure out, how to apply that in your functional work environment. It often has to do with getting better at your actual job versus getting better, say, as in terms of leading others in an organization. So everyone's really familiar with this online learning that you do for your sexual harassment training is a style of horizontal development. And generally, companies provide a lot of horizontal development. So we like it. It's useful. We've been doing it for a long time.
Before we move on, actually, we have a question that I was able to read quickly that I want to touch on. Can you share the set of circumstances or for capacity? Actually, I think that may, you know what, I'm gonna hold on for a second. I actually go on to the next slide because I think we may touch on that. So
yeah. So someone asked,
Yeah.
when would you need capacity? So yes, let's talk about vertical development. So you see the contrast.
Not only is Lori fabulous, the people who are on this website or on this webcast are so fabulous that they're even pushing things forward. You can see we're all very engaged. It's wonderful. Okay, Lori, talk to us about vertical development.
Okay, vertical development. This is kind of a new style of development that's come up in, say, within the last 5 to 10 years. And it really is growing fairly exponentially because people are feeling like that horizontal development is not creating what they need to deal in the current environment. So vertical development is more an internal job. It's how you're thinking about things. It's your mindset. It's how you combine all your sets of skills and capabilities to really have impact in the organization. It's very contextual. So an example of this might be if you're at one company as a leader and you're super successful, and then you go to another company and everything you did in the first company to be successful doesn't work in the second company because the culture's different, the environment's different, the pacing's different, the style is different. And now you're like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Everything I knew that made me successful isn't working here. This is vertical development. It's been difficult for organizations to take this on because it's much more intangible. Skill development, very tangible. You can actually measure, did people take the class? You can measure, did they do it? You can even measure pretty well, do they have that individual skill? But it's difficult to measure how were people operating in an environment, and was that the appropriate response given the context, given the situation, given whatever is going on. How do you measure that? It's really difficult. So companies tend to be more comfortable in the tangible side of things, and yet our whole leadership environment has gotten more and more intangible as we go along. Like, it's very difficult these days just to predict what's coming next. And then once something does show up, how do you deal with it? That's more the vertical development idea.
Are there any specific capacities or specific, I want to use the term capacity, not skill, or specific capacities or qualities that you found in leaders who are better able to navigate change, whether it be moving to a new organization or restructuring? Because it seems like change is the new normal, right? Whether it's we're suddenly working from home because of the pandemic, or you have a new CEO, or you've switched jobs. I mean, change is pretty much the constant now. Are there certain capacities that you think help people weather that and be able to be effective leaders when change happens?
Yes, there are. And at the end of this, we'll get to a model that shows some of that. But one of the things that's very different currently is, in the past, you could almost stack your experience. You'd be like, okay, now I know how to be a manager. Now I know how to be a senior manager. Now I know how to be a director. And you could just stack that up over time. And for large organizations, that trajectory of leadership development actually would go on for 20 years. And what worked previously still worked because the environment hadn't changed. you're actually at the same company. When I started my career, no one changed companies every 3 or 4 years. You stayed at one company, or maybe two your entire career. Okay, now that experience doesn't stack. So each time you're in a new environment, a new situation, new events are happening, what you did previously no longer works. So the key quality here is a kind of versatility, a mental flexibility, a skilled flexibility, a pattern recognition flexibility that's going to help you know what to apply in a situation that either is no longer like it was in the past or that you've never faced before. And the pandemic is a great example of that. Like, how did you as a leader and your organization deal with something that hasn't happened in the last, say, 40 years at this level? So there was no experience that you had in the past that was really going to help you directly with that.
One thing that strikes me is kind of building on that point. Not only are we having new experiences, if in the past people had stacked leadership, they also had sort of a natural mentorship model, right? Whoever was above them had experienced what they had and then could help them and guide them and lead them. But if things are new and if experiences are not stacking in the same way, there has to be some other way of providing people with that mentorship and that guidance and that growth development that would normally have come through the leadership experience itself.
Yes, 100%. I'm still a pretty big fan of mentorship because it can be opening doors for folks as well. But remember, the concept of mentorship is, let me share what worked for me. It's past oriented. And so when the environment is less changeable, that was really useful. But now what worked for someone 5 years ago, just even think technology, it's changed so dramatically that it isn't actually going to work anymore, right? You think in most of the arenas, marketing or finance, everything's just changing so dramatically that stories from the past, it can be informative, but you're not going to be able to actually do that and be successful now. So the trend has to be forward looking versus past looking.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. I mean, even you mentioned the concept of technology. I think about, in the past, the people who'd worked there longer would be the experts. I don't know about you, but I know in my organization, I'm often asking my younger colleagues because they're the ones who are leading me. And I hope that I serve as a mentor, but I think in some cases it's more of a life wisdom kind of mentor than necessarily I've been through this situation. So I think there is a different kind of support, which actually I think leads really well to us moving along. I'm going to actually skip the next slide, which is, we talked about horizontal leadership. We talked about vertical leadership, but these are really not competing. These are actually complementary. So can you talk to us a little bit about transformational versus transactional leadership and how they work together and build on each other?
Yeah. I think one of the ways to be successful is using an and when we're talking about development. It really isn't an or. If you're only on one side or the other, that's not going to be enough to address the current environment. So you really need that horizontal development that we call that transactional, not in a bad way, only because it's measurable. You did it or you didn't do it. You completed it or you didn't. You have that skill or you don't have that skill. It's outcome focused, so it's to a specific result, and you can measure, how close you got to that result that you wanted. The vertical development, although it's more transformational, we say transformational because it can be utilized in a wide variety of situations. It might be outcome oriented in some cases, but it's more impact oriented. Are you having the impact that you want in this specific context or situation? It can be applied to very complex situations where the transactional is applied to more predictable or simple situations. And the transformational is that kind of sense of self, sense of maturity. I always call this like the eye of the storm. Like everything can be swirling all around you, but in the center of yourself, there's a calm that you have and are maintaining to allow you to really assess the situations and then apply the skills and capabilities in the best possible way. So you really need both. And it's almost like you can see here, it's almost like a triangle. If you continue to build your foundation of your horizontal development, then you have unlimited vertical development. So they have to work together. If you never build your foundational skills, say after a certain place in your career, now you're going to hit a peak. You won't be able to keep expanding on your vertical development because your base is just not expanding.
I love so much how you put things. And that model of growth and the idea of being, I love the term, the center of yourself, where you are centered and you are grounded, you have the skills that you need, you have the confidence and the personal capacity to be able to handle things that are coming at you that you weren't expecting. Right. Which I think is something we all want, right? I mean, that personally, we want it in our leaders, we want it in the people around us. So I'm actually going to move to the next piece, which you mentioned before that these things are hard to measure. It's hard to know if you're doing well. And I have to be honest, the first time I saw this slide, Lori, I thought, man, I want to be able to do all those things. And I want to work for the person who does all those things. It's a lot, but this to me is so much.
It's a lot. It's a lot. So again,
being an amazing leader, being an amazing, really centered, grounded person. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about this. It's kind of an assessment model, but I know you talked about assessment versus alignment. So can you explain a little bit more about this internal compass, which I think it's so rich?
Yeah. Great. So that kind of eye of the storm really is at the center of this model. And then these 4 sets of capacities surrounding that, and then kind of the subcapacities are really what those capacities mean, is this model. And if you both think of yourself, I actually think many people have that response, Katie, like, wow, not only do I want this, I want to work for somebody who's operating this way, because wouldn't this be just an amazing leader? So this flexibility, if you're rigid in your thinking, if you are trying to do everything the way you used to do it, you're not going to be that successful in this environment. So this flexibility is really key. And there's a bunch of components around that flexibility that's needed for that to be useful for yourself and others. We're using the term velocity, but I actually really like the subtenets of this one, because courage, you have to have a lot of courage to be able to address situations that you've never addressed before, and to do that with that same sense of equilibrium internally. It's not easy. And so it really takes that tenaciousness, that focus on what you're trying to do. And it takes a lot of agility, which is sort of the next door neighbor here to flexibility. The pattern recognition is a really interesting one. It's a capacity that I think all successful leaders have, but is rarely named. And that pattern recognition useful because instead of doing exactly what you did in another situation or context before, you can look for the patterns that are similar. And those similarities then help you apply what you already know to a new context. You might have to do that with flexibility, but you won't feel like you're flying blind, because you'll be like, this is not exactly the same, but it's close. But you can't use that pattern recognition by itself. You can just see with our economy right now, we keep going back to, oh, this is how it was in the 70s. This is the last time inflation was like this. And then the next language is, but it's not operating the same way. So it's not exactly the same thing, but you can still look for the patterns. And then inside that is this curiosity that you have to have. If you're in the place of thinking you're not going to be looking for something new. You're not going to be looking for patterns that apply in this context. So, of course, from a coaching background, curiosity is a basic tenet of that, but we find that that works really, really well for leadership also. And then the last part, self-regulation. Everyone kind of knows this one, but we don't usually delve into it to the more individual components. And I feel like this is a change that's been coming to leaders over time, all the way from the past when it was kind of acceptable to yell and scream and get really upset. That's no longer acceptable anymore. So being able to regulate your own emotions and get yourself back to that sense of equilibrium so you can apply yourself in the best possible way now becomes a critical capacity.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I love what you're saying. It's interesting. I do some work with schools, and one of the things we talk about is that we all focus a lot on the basics, which are really important. But when you talk about the things that people lose their job, it's the interpersonal. So, it's a lot of those. And actually, that brings me to, I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions that we've received. And so it's going to be a two-parter for you, Laura. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay, the first one is one of the participants noticed that there's a lot of overlap between this and emotional intelligence, which we know is such a big factor in success. So, and then there's also a secondary question, which is how can you assess for this when you have candidates or when you're looking to promote? So can you help us understand the distinction? And then also what are some ways to be on the lookout for this when you're trying to figure out who to put in leadership positions?
Mm-hmm. So I would say in terms of emotional intelligence, yes, some of those concepts are in here because really to be an exceptional leader, you have to have some emotional intelligence. But notice you can't only have that, right? You have to have some other things as well. So certainly the self-regulation parts of this model have a basis in emotional intelligence and in a couple of other places as well. But the more mental, sort of logical mind work around this is additive with emotional intelligence. It's almost like emotional intelligence plus IQ plus contextual understanding, is the winning formula now. So this is kind of a combination of all those areas that we think go into this exceptional leadership and really a sense of leadership maturity. Yes, emotional intelligence is important, but it's not the only piece of this. It's part of the pie. It's a slice of the pie. Yeah. In terms of how you're going to use this, we are starting to measure this almost from a social science background, like over 4 traits. How are you thinking about this? How are you feeling about this? How are you experiencing this? And then how are others experiencing this from you? So it's a little different than the assessments we've really used for the last 30, 40 years that are all on a numeric scale. Are you really going to be able to measure courage or judgment on a numeric scale? It's going to be really difficult. So the whole measurement of this has to be different. And a way I think about it super simply, if we step out of behavioral science for a while, I think of this as like circles. Like, do you have a small circle in flexibility or do you have a big circle? That's the idea of capacity. I have a small cup. I only have a 4-ounce cup in flexibility. That my capacity is only 4 ounces, or I have a gallon there. The concept of capacity is you can always increase it. So nobody ever gets to 100% or gets to 10 or whatever the scale is. So those scales no longer work in this context.
So I have a couple more questions, actually a few more questions. One of them is, are there specific, how can dynamic leaders manage the risk and complex landscape in an increasingly complex from a regulatory point of view? So we're looking at dealing with all the regulations, but also there's risk and compliance. And I have to say, my initial reaction, I'd love to hear yours, is that to me, a model like this is actually exactly what we need in a complex landscape, right? The skills and the knowledge, that's very much for dealing with the regulatory challenges. And then a lot of the more vertical pieces, the capacity, are dealing with what does that look like in real life, right? What is this? Yeah. How do we apply that to this situation? How do we deal with the times when what we know versus, we either have two different sets of conflicting values. We talk about that a lot in ethics and compliance, or there's no regulation, there's no policy on this. So what is the right way to go forward? But I would love to hear your thoughts on how this leadership model overlaps with really the challenges of ethics and compliance and the complexity that department, that field encounters on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think I'll agree with you completely that it's very applicable. So what I think has happened in just the regulatory environment in general is it has been fairly static. So because of all the rules and regulations, we communicate those and they're very clear. But when it comes to the moment, the individual making a decision around what to actually do, this is where this comes into play, because you might know the regulation or, what your quote's supposed to do, but you need situational awareness right in that moment to be able to make a judgment. You might need courage to say no to something that's very tempting. Right? You might need some intellectual flexibility to really determine, like, is this the letter of the law or not? You might need some self-reflection to be like, wait, is this the right answer here? What's the consequences down the road if I do this? And I think there's a pretty, back to your idea of integrity gap, there's a lot of your own research that shows that everyone thinks integrity is important, and yet only around with something like 40 some percent of the 42% of surveyed board members felt like a lack of integrity is happening in the organizations that they are on the board of. So that gap between like 97% of people want that, and yet still 42% are not operating at that level. That gap right there is where this model can help to close that gap. It may not close it all the way because, there's some things that are still out of our control, but I think it would minimize that gap to talk about this model around specific challenging ethical situations that employees or leaders are facing, or organizations.
So one of the other questions that's come in is about what strategies can be employed to foster a culture of ethics and responsibility. And it's interesting to me that a lot of the things that I would recommend from our research, which is, being open to people when they have questions and concerns, talking about your values, certainly living up to your values, supporting people that are going. It seems like they blend so well with a lot of these same skills. There's so many of them that are about really being a well integrated person of integrity, right? The person who has the knowledge to do things well, but also the internal capacity to know how to do them well in a particular situation and to be committed to values in challenging situations. So I think there's such a beautiful marriage between these two concepts. So I know we're getting close to time, so I want to get to a couple of questions that get to this last piece, which is they would love to know about how we can bring E&C and HR together to kind of bring this to the forefront, and then also circumstances that lead to capacity building. And I swear I didn't tee up these questions, but people would love to hear from you, Lori. How do you help people? So let's talk. How do you help people?
Yeah. Okay. Go back one more time. So let me get the first one first, and then we'll slip to this one. Go to the other model. Go to the model. Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Thank you. We didn't use this word because we're looking more broadly to organizations beyond just compliance. But you could almost think of this blue center capacity really is the capacity of integrity. Like it's really at the center of the whole thing. So I think that's how it fits really nicely. And having the compliance side of the company and the people and culture, HR side of the company collaborating on this, it's actually mutually beneficial. Just organizations over a long time start to be siloed. And here's an opportunity for compliance leaders to go, cross-functional, to cross those silos and bring something to the organization that's going to have dual impact. It's going to develop leaders and it's going to create a more ethical environment in the organization at the same time. I mean, and I'll just say one last thing about that integrity in the center. Like, if you are an employee or say a follower of a leader, one of the number one reasons people follow a leader is they trust that person. And that trust is, integrity is the center of that trust. Once the integrity is violated, now the trust is violated and people don't want to follow that leader. So whether it, whatever the organizational outcome you're looking for, that's still at the core of it, whether it's leader development, or compliance. Now you can go forward. How do you develop?
I'm going to jump in since you brought up one thing I love so much about what you just said, and I think is so true, is that there is such a tendency to silo, but really these are complementary functions that both help each other. Yes. I mean, people are going to want to work for a leader who demonstrates integrity. They're going to work harder. They're going to be more committed to the organization. You're going to have fewer HR issues. So these are things that this should be a team. And the more they're a team, the more everybody wins, right?
Yeah, they're going to feel like they were treated fairly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so tell us how you can help us. We want to hear.
Okay. So one of the things about vertical development is it's hard to develop in a self-learning approach. It requires interaction so that people have a mirror to be able to see themselves, because just as human beings, we're kind of self-delusional. We tend to we tend to think of ourselves either better than we are or not as good as we are. And it really takes that external mirror for us to get an accurate representation of ourselves. So mentorship, sponsorship, one-on-one coaching, group coaching, in the moment coaching, like a new thing that's been coming up is this on-demand coaching. Say I'm facing a challenging situation and I'm not sure which way to go. I can call up a coach who can, not going to tell me the answer, but is going to help me think through the answer and draw on the various capacities to be able to do that. Sponsorships are really great because it's not just telling people what you did in those situations or in the past. It's really championing that individual and helping them advance their thinking and advance in the organization. And Sounding Board itself, we offer the software to track all of this, because one reason this hasn't been deployed more broadly is it's complex to track. And up till recently, it's only been tracked really on paper or in spreadsheets. Now we have the software for you to be able to track this organization wide, so you can see who's getting the vertical development and make some choices about who to offer that to.
I love that your offerings kind of mirror your model. You've got sort of this hard fact skills, but then you've got the things that are more interactive and a little bit more situational. It's such a nice reflection of all the things that you're talking about. So well done.
Thank you.
I also love the idea of having someone champion you. Who doesn't want a champion every day? I think
Right.
I love that term. So we could all use champions in the workplace. So thank you. This is just a wonderful set of ways to help organizations and across a very broad spectrum of ways. Also, I'm so excited to share with you that you can have Lori in your own home on your bookshelf. So tell us about this, Lori.
Well, I have a book coming out in October. It was basically to share, my 30 years of leader development through executive coaching. And it kind of turned into a blend of a memoir, giving a lot of stories about that experience, but also being very future looking, showing this model and some other models around where we're going as the wheel in leader development, revolves to the next level.
So as a bit of an aside, so Lori, I know you told me that people said this felt like a memoir. One of the things that I did in my master's project was I was studying the use of story in education. And there's actual research that shows that if you can make that emotional connection and a story connection, the connections in the brain, the imprint on the brain is literally deeper. So what a wonderful piece of feedback about, because it means that not only are this is wonderful information, but you're presenting it in a way that's really connecting with people on an emotional level and a deep level where it's really imprinting on their brain. So I'm so excited to read it. But I'm actually going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Ellie, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we have at ECI that can help you with your leadership capacity and give you a broader view of what's happening in the world.
Thank you, Katie. Oops, I went too far. I am very excited to announce that next month we are going to have the 17th iteration of our Global Business Ethics Survey coming out, and we are actually going to be revealing that on a live webinar, just like this one, on September 21st. So you can click the link in the chat now and sign up to join that webinar. It is truly going to be an exciting event. This is the biggest data set that we've ever had. More than 75,000 employees have been surveyed. So make sure you don't miss that. We're very excited.
We are so excited at ECI. We love data. We love data because we know that data can shape and change lives and help us understand the world. So we are so excited to share our new data with you. Thank you, Ellie, for talking to us about that. I'm going the wrong direction. So just want to recap the things that we've talked about. So these are some of the things that we would recommend. Focusing on the results you want and the behaviors that support those results. So what is it you want and how do you get there? And then obviously that idea of integrating the horizontal and the vertical development to increase capacity. These are complementary things that are going to help move your leadership forward. Lori, do you have any closing thoughts?
I'll just say one thing about focusing on the results you want. And there's a whole chapter in the book about this, which is it's actually really difficult to define the results you want. Often you'll say, hey, I want this result. And then as you get that result, you're like, that wasn't exactly it. So just saying this is it's actually not easy to get clarity around what you really want. From an individual perspective, from a leadership perspective, from an organizational perspective. So that's really the key to being able to get those results is define what it is you want initially.
That makes so much sense. I mean, in the process of defining, it's hard work, but it probably is it actually is doing the work, right? The definition is actually doing the work.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know if Carol, are you closing us out? Thank you.
Carol had to run to an appointment, but thank you all so much for joining us. We are so glad that Lori is here. Thank you to Sounding Board for helping us put this event together. And thank you as always to Katie for doing a wonderful job of hosting and facilitating. Make sure you sign up for our next webinar in September, and we hope to see you there. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Katie. A pleasure doing this with you.
Thank you, Lori.
Thanks, Ellie, for your support.
Thanks, Ellie, for being you.